Clapperboard, you're about to hear an original HFY Sci-Fi tale titled, "The Commander Declared Cubs Couldn't Be Controlled, then Froze as They Saluted the Human Instead." Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. They met in a hangar washed in cold luminescence, where the floor hummed with power and the air kept the metallic taste of ships that had outlived their first purpose. The flagship Asterion rested in its cradle like a patient predator, thrusters sleeping, hull scabbed with repairs that looked like scar tissue under the light. Beneath its belly, a small crowd stood in a geometry of tension, human crew in matte blacks, a Virylan detachment in layered scale, and 6 juveniles of that same species lined up with the wary alertness of creatures that had survived more than their age should allow. "Cubs cannot be controlled," Commander Tsark of the Stone Coil declared. His crest lights flickered a flat amber, disdain welded into the angle of his plates. "You can polish a shard. You cannot convince it is a sword." Major Elias Ward didn't answer at first. He watched the 6 juveniles, lean, digitigrade, bioluminescent veins pulsing faintly beneath taut skin. They stood with their weight ready to break in any direction, eyes storm gray and wide. Someone had scrubbed their nesting marks, but the dye still ghosted the edges of their muzzles. The smallest, female by the line of the frill, kept her toes flexed as if the deck might vanish beneath her. "You brought them here," Ward said calmly. His voice was the kind cut to ride over engine noise without ever needing to rise. "You could have refused." Tsark's mouth plates clicked. "I brought them because your admiral and your treaty and the shrinking number of planets where our dead have room to lie demanded it, not because I believed." Ward stepped closer to the juveniles. He didn't bend from the waist like a supplicant. He knelt with a soldier's surety, lowering his height to show his hands were empty and his intent wasn't. He spoke in Virylan nursery cadence, the gentle rhythm he had learned sitting on the floor of a brood warren beside an old storyteller with smoke-soft eyes. "I am Elias," he said. "I am small today so the room will stop trying to crush you." The juvenile's bio-light steadied a fraction. The smallest tilted her head, pupils widening. "Human tricks," Tsark muttered, but the words lacked heat. Ward drew a breath that filled his chest from bottom to top, the kind they taught in the cold rooms on Earth where future officers practiced walking into fire as if it were a door like any other. He raised his open palm. "On my world this means I bring nothing sharp," he said, still in their tongue. "It also means hello." The smallest lifted one hand to mirror him. The movement was precise but tremulous, a bridge built in a storm. One by one the others matched. The deck seemed to exhale. "Observe," Tsark snapped, and barked a command that would have sent an adult cohort into a braced stance. The juveniles flinched. The second from the left started to pivot, panic-kicking muscle. Ward didn't countermand. He said a single soft word. With the smallest froze, then returned to stillness, chin up. The others followed her lead, bio-lights smoothed to a low, determined glow. Lieutenant Mara Khan, Ward's second, whispered near his shoulder, "Sir, they are reading you." Ward didn't glance back. He lifted his right hand again, keeping the elbow tucked, shoulders square, angle exact. A salute, not a demand, a demonstration. The smallest was the first to understand. She moved her hand across her chest where a Virylan might greet a star, then adjusted, mimicking what she had seen. The others mirrored her with awkward sincerity, hands at the wrong height, wrists bent, but it was unmistakable. Tsark's crest lights flickered in a pattern Ward had learned meant surprise chained fast before it could run. The words "I told you so" burned Ward's tongue and dissolved unsaid. He returned the salute the same way he would on a parade ground, clean and respectful. For one suspended second the hangar's machinery, and the long aches of too many losses leveled out, and something like balance took their place. Then the Asterians' alarms coughed to life in a three-tone cadence that meant no time left for speeches. The light shifted from cold white to warm amber. The intercom spoke with Admiral Ivano's composed steel. All hands. Convoy Theta 7 is under engagement at the Dafon Gate. We are moving. Doctrine later, Ward said to Tsark, lives now. The Virilen commander held him in that alien, stone-set gaze a heartbeat longer, then dipped his chin, their version of a nod. Lives now. The ship woke around them. The Asterian shook off inert heat and purred to battle readiness. The crew moved with the reckless care of practiced people. In the war room, the Dafon Gate sprawled across the main display like a wound made of geometry, gravity lanes braided tight, freight lanes tighter, and around it a swarm of shried ghost craft, more absence than object, light bending wrong around edges that posture as nothing. Mara's fingers danced across a console, pulling feeds, triaging panic into actionable data. Freighters breviary soared ellipsis, escorts thin as a hair, ghosts attacking from below the plane, classic Dafon ambush. They know our usual angles. Then we don't use them, Ward said. He brought up maintenance egress maps, the slender arteries installers once used to slip repair skiffs between the gate's bones. We run the freighters through these. Not safe, but safer. Shried drones can't vector fast in those, Tsark said reluctantly, interest carving new lines through skepticism. They eat their own wake and stumble. Ward turned to the juveniles. They stared at the display with a kind of reverent horror. I will run you close, he said in their tongue. You will make the ghosts honest for a heartbeat. Can you do that? The smallest lifted her chin. We can open a door, she said, halting but sure. They launched in the Jackdaw, a slender corvette shaped like an intent held between teeth. Ward flew low and mean, keeping the drives whisper quiet, riding eddies the gate's gravity made as if the universe's math were a river, and he had learned to read its surface. The juveniles strapped into the rear bay, harness lines coiled. Bio-lights threaded through a control rig Mara had coded that turned their patterns into signal, into disruption, into language the Shride's optics hated. The convoy was a mess. A tumble of freighters bleeding drive plasma and panic escort fighters firing into the taste of fear, because otherwise their hands would shake too hard to fly. Ghostcraft flowed around them with lazy malice. The Jackdaw slipped into the first maintenance shunt, and the Shride drone that followed careened on the turn and clipped its own tail into scrap. Ward coached the freighters through shunt mouths barely wider than their pride. Ease, ease, let the math do it, he said, voice steady. You're too big to bully the gate, you have to ask it. A ghostcraft rolled in on the breviary's blind side, a smear where there should have been nothing. Ward couldn't turn the Jackdaw fast enough without exposing the freighters. He popped the bay. Vacuum snarled. Path, he said, choosing the smallest juvenile's new name because she had earned it by stepping first. Now, Path and her cohort leapt, lines singing. Their bodies were narrow and powerful and made for this, for tight places where fear says no and muscle says move. They hit the ghostcraft's flank shining in frequencies Mara had woven out of hours of staring into Shride optical physics. For a sliver of a second the ghostcraft's camouflage stuttered, and the Asterian's long-range gun carved a straight, merciless line through the lie into the truth beneath. They reeled the juveniles back. Ward's heart did the thing it did in battle, stuttered, steadied, stuttered, never quite trusting it would get to beat again. They ran 3 shunts. They burned 2 more ghosts. The freighters limped toward the far throat where friendly pickets waited like hands cupped in the dark. Back in the Asterian's hangar, no one raised a cheer. Some ships taught their crews to celebrate survival like theft. The Asterian taught them to breathe, to count, to clean their tools and then themselves, to tell names softly so they would not forget who they had saved and who they had not. Sark met them in decon. He looked at the juveniles, then at Ward, and his crest lights dimmed to the respectful gray of a soldier who has just met a new fact and is brave enough to hold it. "I said they could not be controlled," he admitted. "I was trying to say they could not be made to obey. What you did was not that." "I didn't command," Ward said. "I invited." Sark's plates shifted in a hard equivalent of a smile. "Humans make invitations sound like orders you give yourself." Ward found the juveniles later in a cargo bay turned into a dusk-dim den, the floor layered with mats and warmth strips, the lights low in a way that made virile bodies loosen. Path lay nearest the entrance, one frill bandaged where a shard had sung past and kissed bone. When Ward stepped inside, she watched him the way a mountain watches, whether still, present, older than fear. "We ran," she said, English careful in her mouth. "You did," he said, and sat. "You opened the door." She breathed and he matched his breath to hers. The others slept. Outside, the Asterian glided on vectors built of exhaustion and habit. Somewhere beyond that hull, a convoy captain told a story into a recorder, voice shaking, about a small ship that appeared like a promise and then disappeared like one fulfilled. The war taught itself new tricks and used them. At the Threnody Rift, echo shards lured the jackdaw into a cul-de-sac of frozen iron, where the hull sang with a sound that made bones feel porous. Mara took a splinter through the arm and cursed in 3 languages, while Medfoam tried to remember how human blood coagulated. Sark began drilling the juveniles in the old cohort ways, but changed them on the fly, hammering discipline without breaking the flexible part of courage that let small bodies move the way physics sometimes allowed if you were impolite to it. They grew path ahead taller, limbs sure, the others smoothing out the jitter in their movements into a kind of dance. They learned to shape their bio-light pulses into language Ward could read at a glance across any distance that allowed seeing. Hold, pivot, danger, go now. The ship learned too, bending routines around them, carving space in schedules where rest meant singing, where breath meant not just inhaling but finding a rhythm that wasn't panic. Then came the summons to Hadean Gate, a shried staging ground hung with scaffolds black as fresh oil, their ghosts thick and arrogant, not needing to hide because numbers were a kind of camouflage. Admiral Ivano traced the plan in a voice like sharpened glass. "Noise here, here, and here," she said, tapping the void like a seamstress. "Silence in these folds. The jackdaw runs the seam." The opening bars of engagement sounded like 300 alarms attempting harmony and missing. The Asterian took the first cuts and stayed upright. Ward flew not like a hero, but like a man laying track ahead of a train that hadn't learned to stop. Path and her cohort moved so fast their tethers blurred, their light speaking a grammar the shride's optical lies stuttered to parse. For a handful of breaths the ghosts looked like ships again, and the coalition's guns remembered how to kill them. The third spire ate everything they fed it. Sark broke ranks and went in, not because orders said so, but because grief did, and he refused to pretend any longer that grief wasn't a language. The cohort followed as if their bodies were strings tied to his wrists. Ward followed because humans do that, throw themselves toward edges for each other, and then figure out afterward how they didn't fall. Inside the spire's throat, physics argued with itself and lost. Path wedged her body into a narrowing that had already begun to close and held it with claws and will, while Mara screamed coordinates into Ward's ear, and the Asterian lined up a shot that would pop the cork without bursting the bottle. When the beam came, it was a line so clean it made a mockery of every messy human thing. The spire's lens cracked along a neat seam that might have been designed for just that failure. The net around Hadean Gate collapsed like snow hammered by a warm wind. They paid for it. There is always a till. Names went on the wall in the mess in grease pencil that no one ever scrubbed off because the residue would leave a mark anyway. Path slept 13 hours and woke with the look of someone who had been inside a place where air was a promise. Sark's plates showed new scratches no one commented on. Ward stared into a sink while water ran across his hands and didn't feel it until Mara turned the faucet off and said, "Enough." "Not yet," he said, and then after a breath, "Soon." The new doctrine did not write itself in a day. It wrote itself in hundreds of small acts someone had to choose. Ward submitted an addendum to coalition field manuals, rapid response door-hand cotters, guidance for training juveniles and small-frame allies for micro-theater interventions. He wrote it with precision, with language that wrapped new tenderness in old military logic so no one could call it soft. It caused fights in rooms with flags. It saved lives in rooms with no windows. On a blue-shaded world called Keshen 12, a convoy of hospital ships stuck under a failed anchor screamed for help in silence, because radio waveforms would have made an invitation the Shride couldn't refuse. The Jackdaw slid in on dead thrusters, using only the frame's inertia and Ward's distant hope that the math would be merciful. Path clipped lines to hulls the size of apartment buildings, and used light to turn targets into ghosts and ghosts into targets. They came away with 11 ships more than anyone thought possible, 3 fewer than anyone could forgive. At the debrief, Ward folded his hands and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Next time we start 2 minutes earlier." He wrote it down. They started 2 minutes earlier next time. Path learned Terran hand signs and taught virile bio-light to human medics, who used it to speak in theaters where silence kept patients alive. Children in the Asterian's creche practiced saluting with sloppy joy, some with 3 fingers, some with 4, all with the earnestness that makes adults look away so their hearts won't trip over anything soft. Sark learned to tell a joke so dry it left dust on the tongue. Mara healed and then re-broke her arm during a boarding action that ended with a Shride gunner choosing to eject rather than be captured. She didn't flinch when she saw that choice. She flinched later when a child ran around a corner too fast and skidded on the deck. News spread like weather. At Dafon, a human taught cubs to salute. At Hadian, a V-Rylan held a beating door with her body. At Keshen 12, a ship ran on faith in gravity's grace. Stories calved off facts and floated away. Some found shores and built villages. Some sank. A year after Dafon, an old ally came aboard Asterian to negotiate for ships he would not get. He saw the juveniles. No longer juveniles, taller now, tools slung across shoulders, confidence in the set of their feet. He said, "You cannot rely on them. They will bolt. They are young." Path walked past him without moving her eyes and laid a hand on her heart and then raised her palm with human emptiness in the center, a blended greeting borrowed from the day survival began. The ally stumbled on his next sentence and never found the old one again. He left the Asterian with fewer ships than he hoped for and more ideas than he wanted. In the quiet between assignments, Ward went to the observation blister to watch stars behave themselves. Path joined him sometimes and they stood without speaking, bio-light and heartbeat finding a common pulse. Once she asked in a voice that had not yet forgotten how young it was, "Do humans always keep moving?" "No," Ward said, "telling the truth because you owe it to those who trust you. Sometimes we stop and break and lie to ourselves and sleep for years with our eyes open, but we try to keep moving again after. Because you control," she said, tasting the word Sark had used like a bitter leaf. "No," he said, looking at the cold lights beyond the glass, "because we endure." The Shride changed the rules twice more. They poured machine minds into decoy hulls that learned to gasp like injured people on a distress band, until medevac ships came close enough to gut. They laced passage corridors with lenses that bent bullets 90 degrees around corners to kill behind cover. The coalition adapted. It always took a death to mark the place where the adaptation should start. Ward wrote those names down in a book he carried close to the body, not for ceremony but for weight. At Mortmain Reach, The coalition came as close to breaking as a rope can stretch without popping. The jackdaw ended up half-embedded in a shried frame stack, air hissing through a seam the width of Ward's thumb, while Path braced a cracked girder with both arms and sang the old brood-worn song the storyteller had taught Ward. He sang with her, off-key, wrong syllables, until oxygen levels ticked back up and the patch held. Afterward, they laughed like people too tired to cry. Sark stared at them and then let his crest lights flicker the pattern that meant, "I suppose I am glad you are ridiculous." Years stretched. The Asterian aged past pride and into the stubbornness that holds up bridges and flagpoles. The crew learned to read one another's silences. The Dorhan cotters spread across the fleet, some trained with Vyrylan, some with Terran, some with partners whose anatomies required new harness designs and new patience. What had been miracle hardened into method the way bread hardens into habit. And yet, some days felt like that first day in the hangar. White light, cold floor, the weight of someone else's certainty pressing down until your ribs felt like bad welds. On one such day, a mid-level bureaucrat with a tight collar and a loose grip on anything that mattered said to Ward, "Your program looks like coddling. Fear is the lever by which we pry performance from soldiers." Ward didn't speak for a long moment. He looked at the man and thought of Path's frill bandage, Sark's bad jokes, Mara's forearm scar shaped like a hawk's wing. He thought of the first salute and then the 12,000 that came after it. He said quietly, "You can pry performance from a machine with fear. You can only get endurance from a person by standing with them when they are afraid." He wasn't demoted. He wasn't promoted. He went back to the hangar and checked the jackdaw's seals like a priest checking an altar's stones. Path found him there and handed him a mug of bitter tea that Vyrylan stayed stubbornly convinced humans liked. He drank it because she had carried it. Sometimes it isn't about the taste. The end of the beginning came like this. 3 gates went quiet at once. Shried ghostcraft pulled back as if on a shared leash. A rumor bloomed that their machine minds had found something else to occupy them. An internal contradiction, a more interesting prey, a command from a master none of them had seen. The rumor was almost certainly wrong and entirely comforting. Civilians stepped into the sun and ached at how bright it had gotten while they were inside. Ward stood in the war room with Mara and Sark and Path and listened to reports that didn't sound like a trap. He let his body unclench in careful degrees. He told ships to rest, not as a reward but as maintenance. He authorized more schoolrooms on more decks because it turns out you win wars by teaching children to read in safety. Until the world is big enough, you don't need to call it a war anymore. Later, he walked the hangar alone. He tried to remember the exact timbre of Sark's contempt that first day and couldn't. The memory had filed its edges down until the conversation was only a shape gentled by time. He touched the jackdaw's hull. It was warm from work. Path stepped into the doorway and waited until he saw her. "We will run again," she said. "Different gates, different ghosts." "Yes," Ward said, "but maybe with different reasons." "What reasons?" "Not just not dying," he said, and surprised himself with the sound of hope in his voice. "Maybe building, maybe singing because we like the song." Path considered the shape of that and then nodded. "Beside," she said. "Beside," he echoed and thought, control was never the point. On a planet stitched together by refugee hands, a small crowd watched a parade that wasn't quite sure it was a parade. Children in mismatched uniforms walked with small chins lifted. Some saluted with human palms. Some laid hands on hearts. A Vyrylan elder told a story about a day in a hangar when a human knelt and said hello with an open hand. The children listened as if the story were air. In a window above the square, a woman who had lost 3 brothers to 3 different kinds of fire set bread to rise and thought, inexplicably, of rivers. The Asterian's night cycle deepened. Mara sat in the mess tracing the scar on her arm as if reading braille written by battles. Sark sealed a crack in his plate with a compound that smelled like thunder. Ward stood in the observation blister, palms against glass, and watched stars do what they had promised since Earth first learned to look up. Simply be there, ungoverned, necessary. Path joined him. They said nothing for a while. Then Ward lifted his hand, palm open to the cold. Path mirrored him, bio-lights blooming soft. They stood until the moment turned from a thing happening to them into a thing they were making together. Across a dozen systems, in strangers' doorways and under repaired street lamps, in hospital corridors and in the backs of freight trucks, in quiet rooms where people finally allowed themselves to breathe, others lifted their hands without quite knowing why, palms open, hands empty, greeting whatever came next without pretending it would be easy. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.